All right, hello, and welcome to my channel. This is an educational channel, and we try to survey a lot of great theories of everything, all-encompassing theories, cosmologies, cosmogonies, grand unified theories, magnum opuses, tour de forces, and earth-shattering discoveries from obscure sources. And we hope that all this helps you out with your paradigm shifting, your awakening to 5D consciousness, your formation of a holistic worldview, your quest for better spiritual, mental, and physical health. And what we've been doing the last 171 days is the Reciprocal Church unit, where we are trying to marshal our resources of numinosity, our spiritual resources that we can use to kind of assemble a coherent spiritual approach, coherent, really, religion, or reciprocal religion, one over religion. And because it's kind of like a survival move, because the Western religions are right about to collapse under their own weight as not being in harmony with the evidence. And so we've been just starting here in the last few days after looking at some creative so-called jazz music and some Buddhist meditation instructions, and we looked at kind of a survey of the Dead Sea Scrolls. We've now started embarking on a decode of the New Testament using many different ciphers, including the Dead Sea Scrolls, Joseph Atwill's Caesar hypothesis, another Caesar hypothesis, more like Julius Caesar, whereas Atwill is focused on the Flavian emperors. We also have the work of John Allegro, his discussion of the sacred mushroom and the cross. Robert Taylor, who takes back in the 18th and 19th century, took a mythological approach, well, really astrological approach, also mythological approaches, and we also have physiological approaches, looking at the Gospels especially as instructions for your microcosmic orbit or some type of alchemical process in your body. And what's great is that all of these things can all be true. There could be a number of different layers of interpretation within the New Testament. We're going to try to stick with the text, and we'll also point out the more obvious superficial readings, what the text actually, says on the surface, and then digging in a little bit deeper. And, if you're tempted to want to think that you have a literal interpretation or historical interpretation of these scriptures, this might deepen your assessment, because they can be looked at a number of different ways, and it's very obvious that it was intended to be that way. This is especially true if you're looking at the Joseph Atwill picture from his book Caesar's Messiah and Shakespeare's Secret Messiah, how the works of Josephus, the late 1st century historian, who is really the only source of history that we have from the first century other than the New Testament. And now the more recently discovered Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in the mid 20th century, and how it's very clear that the parallels between the book by Josephus called War of the Jews and the New Testament are beyond coincidental. I'd say way beyond Q territory, and they show pretty clearly, along with giving their signature, which we'll get into eventually, but that Josephus, he's cited often as being the person that kind of legitimizes Christianity because he's an actual historian that mentions the existence of Jesus, the only, other than possibly Tacitus, and who also is in the same boat, because you eventually discover that Josephus, even though he was a Jew and fought as a general in the War of the Jews, he surrendered to Vespasian, the Roman general, and eventually defected to the Romans. He gave Vespasian the so-called star prophecy, which was to say that he took the Jewish tradition and applied it to the Romans, saying that he prophesied that Vespasian would one day become the emperor, which he did in a short amount of time. And so Vespasian in 69 AD was brought to Rome to become emperor. He appointed Titus, his son, to take over the military campaign in this war against the Jews in Palestine. And Josephus went right along with Vespasian. Vespasian adopted him as his son. Okay, so when you're looking at the work of Josephus, you're not looking at an objective source. You're looking at a person under not only the patronage, but the actual son of the Roman Caesar. And then eventually when Vespasian dies and Titus and Domitian, his two children, his two sons, become emperors, Vespasian is really, Josephus is really their adopted brother. So the idea of using Josephus as a real history is, I'd say, as shaky, if not shakier, than using the New Testament as real history. You can see over and over again how Josephus fakes dates and stuff like that. And he does it to line up this theme, these themes that he's using, where he's running parallels between the Gospels and his book, War of the Jews. We looked at a few examples in the past couple days. Basically, what Josephus does in the Gospels is that he backdates the life of Jesus back into the 30s AD. Josephus is writing in the 70s or 80s AD, and so he backdates Jesus by 40 or 50 years, goes through his life, and everything that Jesus prophesies comes to pass as a result of the actions of Titus, who is the Roman military general from 70 to 73. They both have a parallel existence. So wherever Jesus goes in his travels, in his 3-year ministry, those are the exact same places that Titus goes in his 3-year military campaign. So we looked first where they went to Gennesaret, Jesus went to Gennesaret, and he recruited Simon and Andrew to be his disciples. He told them that they would become fishers of men. And what happens is when Jesus speaks metaphorically like that, whenever he talks metaphorically like that, what he says actually comes true literally in the War of the Jews. So he goes to Gennesaret and he meets Simon and Andrew and convinces them to follow him and to become fishers of men. In the War of the Jews, Titus is fighting a battle at Gennesaret. Actually, I think this was just kind of pre. Titus was there, but I think Vespasian might have still been the general. But then at Gennesaret, they're fighting what Gennesaret is the Sea of Galilee. And they're fighting the Jews, and many of the Jews fell into the water. And whenever they lifted their head up above the water, they were beset with a lot of darts and spears. And Josephus describes how the Roman soldiers under Titus were fishing for men, just like in the New Testament. Jesus says you're going to be fishers of men. In War of the Jews, that is literally what he's talking about. So then we looked at another example of the Passover lamb, and basically Jesus says at the Last Supper, he says to his disciples, eat of my flesh and drink of my blood. And if you look in Josephus, again, Jesus is speaking metaphorically, eat of my flesh, drink of my blood. And if you look at Josephus's War of the Jews, it focuses on an episode during the siege of Jerusalem. The Romans are sieging Jerusalem. They've surrounded, and people are basically caught inside of the city walls, and they're kind of just waiting for them waiting to die. They have really no chance of getting out or getting anywhere, and they have no supplies. And Josephus focuses on a woman named Mary, and Mary is living in Jerusalem, and she is starving, and she decides that she's going to eat her son, the son of Mary. So she kills her son and she roasts him, which is listed in Exodus 12. These are the instructions for your Passover lamb. You can't eat it raw. You can't boil it. You have to roast it. And Mary takes the Passover lamb and roasts it and eats half of it, but saves the other half of it for, I don't know what, but eventually the Romans, come in to her dwelling, and she offers them the other half of the dead baby roasted. And the Romans are freaked out, they're repulsed by it. And she says, I saved a very fine portion, I saved a very fine portion for you. And that is echoed in the book of John, where Lazarus is sick. John 11. Lazarus is sick, and he goes and dies. Jesus eventually resurrects him, but he comes to the house first, and he gets anointed, I believe, by Mary. But Martha is upset because Mary is not helping her with the house, with preparing the meal. And Jesus says, let Mary stay with me because she has the good portion. So this is the good portion that is not to be taken away from her. And that's the same thing that happens in the War of the Jews. Mary offers them a very fine portion, but they don't take it. So it is not taken away from her. Eventually, Jesus so-called resurrects Lazarus and brings him to the house. What they don't tell you is that Lazarus is really dead. And Jesus takes him to the house to roast him. They say they brought in Lazarus and they made him a supper. They're mocking you like crazy if you believe this stuff. Okay, so the next episode in chapter 4 that Atwell's getting at is, and I mean, there's many other details that I'm leaving out, but this one is also a little bit complicated, but it's when both Jesus and Titus go to Gadara. And the story that's in the Gadara scene in the New Testament is pretty much incoherent and is lacking in any type of theological significance other than casting out demons. And when that happens, you know that there's a code that's being invoked and there's a hidden meaning there. So Jesus arrives at Gadara and he encounters this character who is a real rough operator. He can't be contained. They tried to put him in chains and he tore his chains off or cut them off with rocks. And but when he sees Jesus, he has a kind of a submissive type of mien, and Jesus asks him, "Who are you?" And he says, "My name is Legion, for we are many." So these are all the demons that are infecting this person. And Jesus negotiates with the demon, and the demon says, "Why don't you put me into those herd of pigs?" Now keep in mind that the Jews don't like pigs. They don't eat pigs. But so the Jesus exorcises the demons from this human and puts them into the pigs. Apparently about 2,000 of them. And the pigs go crazy and they lose their minds and they run off a cliff into the water and they all die. Now, in Josephus, he's talking about really what you call the Sicarii. And the Sicarii are the Jewish zealots, the Jews that will fight to the death to drive out the Romans, that will, they mock the Romans. They go like this to the Romans because they're like, "Go ahead, cut my throat." Because the Romans are trying to get, like, so many times the Romans tried to place a bust or a statue of Caesar in the Roman temple. And that is, obviously from the golden calf and everything, that's taboo. And the Jews, these zealots, these Sicarii, would rather die than, look at this graven image in the temple. The Sicarii also are terrorists because they kill their own they kill the other Jews who have Hellenistic or Romanistic tendencies, who kind of like either speak Greek or have adopted some of the customs of the Greeks or the Romans and have turned their back on the traditional ways. So Josephus refers to these Sicarii as really demons. And it's the same kind of idea that there is a leader of the demons, a leader of the Sicarii, who tries to recruit all these other Jews into their, movement. And so Josephus describes one Sicarii as infecting thousands of others. And so it's the same kind of thing. And Josephus describes the amount of them as too small for an army and too many for a gang of thieves, which is a fairly specific expression for a legion, a Roman legion, which is supposed to be like 2,000 to 5,000 or something like that. So, so what happens is, with the herd of swine, they just start going crazy and running around wildly, and about 2,000 of them basically jumped off a cliff and drowned. Then and this is all again at Gadara, and then let's see, Josephus's description of the Battle of Gadara, the gospel stories of the demoniac of Gadara as a satire of them. So the New Testament characters are the unnamed demoniac or whatever, the demons, and the swine that the demons infect. In the War of the Jews, the characters are the rebel leader named John. He's the demon who infects this, and then the Sicarii, which I guess are, I'm a little bit confused here. The Sicarii and the group that the Sicarii conscripts, and then also in Josephus there are, because what happens is all of the, I believe it's all of these, so what happens is that the Romans win this battle and they take 2,200 prisoners. In the Gospels, it's 2,000 swine, but in this, it's 2,200. And again, the Romans are insulting the Jews by paralleling them with swine, just like they did with fishes. Those are kind of two things that they use to insult the Jews. And then in this version of the story, the 2,200 are captured along with herds of asses, sheep, camels, and oxen. But no pigs, because the pigs have already died because they jumped off the cliff. So let's see, I think and then the story gets a little bit more complicated, because then it starts to focus on John, who is the leader of the Sicarii, but then also Simon, who is another one of the leaders of the Sicarii. And I pointed out before that, the names of the disciples in the Gospels and in many of Josephus's stories are borrowed from the Maccabeans. The Maccabeans were the Jews who successfully rebelled against the Greeks in the 2nd century BC, and basically ran Judea Palestine as a kind of sovereign country for about a century until the Romans invaded. And the Maccabees, there was Judas and there was Simon, and all of the names that are James, of the disciples, and not all of them, but so Simon and John are the leaders of the Sicarii here, and this date, this is at the War of the Jews. That's 66 to 73 AD. And these Simon and John run away, and they take refuge in these caves beneath Jerusalem. But eventually they're forced out by starvation and to come out of the tombs. Now the tombs is where the demoniac, the guy who was infected with the demons, where he came out of. Somebody who cuts himself with stones is how he's described. In Josephus, Simon is being followed by a bunch of people who are called stonecutters. Okay, so in the Gospels it says someone who cuts himself with stones. In Josephus, they just call them stonecutters. So Simon, during the siege of Jerusalem, was in the upper city, but when the Roman army was gotten within the walls and were laying the city waste, he then took the most faithful friends with him. Those are the stonecutters. Josephus records that after being captured, John, who was one of the leaders, was given life imprisonment, while Simon was taken to Rome and executed. Now, if you know your New Testament, you know that in the book of John, I believe it's in the book of John, at the end, Simon Peter and Jesus, here we go. Jesus is seemingly speaking symbolically, but Josephus's history shows a comically literal meaning to Jesus' encounter with Simon Peter, where Jesus foresees that Simon will be bound and carried where you do not wish to go. Jesus also tells Simon that he will have a martyr's death to glorify God. Okay, so in Josephus, Simon is captured and taken to Rome and executed. But John, the disciple that Jesus loved, as he's described in John, Simon asks Jesus what the fate of John is to be. Jesus replies, "It is my will that he remain." The passage then points out that John is the disciple who is bearing witness to these things and who has written these things. The author goes to great lengths to avoid calling the apostles by their real names to make it less obvious the parallels. But if you can remember some of the other details, then you can understand that he's referring to John, and in the War of the Jews, John is taken away and put in prison for life, where he's said to have supposed to have written his memoirs or whatever. In the Gospels, John is my will that he will remain, says Jesus. So there's a Simon and a John. The Simon is taken away and executed in Rome, and John is put in prison for life. Okay, so here are some of the parallels. Characters are named Simon and John. Both sets of characters are judged. Both sides of the parallel occur at the conclusion of a campaign. Both occur at Gadara. In each, Simon goes to a martyr's death after being placed in bonds and taken someplace he does not wish to go. In each, John is spared. In each, Simon follows. Josephus writes, Simon, thinking he might be able to astonish and delude the Romans, put on a white frock and buttoned upon him a purple cloak and appeared out of the ground in place where the temple had formerly been. So this is actually a reference to something that occurs later with Domitian, the third of the Flavian Caesars, the youngest son of Vespasian, who actually goes through a similar situation, being trapped under Jerusalem, and puts on a purple cloak, I believe, and a mask of Anubis, the Egyptian kind of, I think it's a dog, but the dog god. So once again, Jesus appears to have spoken metaphorically when he tells Simon that he tells Simon that he is the stone upon which he will build a new church that will replace Judaism. And he tells Simon Peter that Peter actually means stone, Petra, petrified. Jesus actually calls the apostle Simon Satan. Satan, get behind me. His strange remarks about the founder of his church is rendered coherent when one understands that Jesus is referring in the Roman context to the rebel Simon, who is one of the leaders of the Sicarii. The reader will note that the mysteriousness of many of Jesus' sayings disappears when they are understood within the context of this little parody or satire. Okay, I think we're going to stop right there. There are many more things that I wanted to say about this, but tomorrow I think we're going to move into discussing maybe a couple more of these parallels, but I think we're going to learn a little bit of the decoding of from the perspective of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Some of the vocabulary that's used, the jargon that's used in both, and how much of it is symbolic and is explanatory of some of the mysteries of the Gospels. So, thanks for tuning in today, and hope to see you tomorrow.